If you are here for cracking original research in B2B writing, you're in the right place.
My name is Sarah Griesenbach, founder of the B2B Writing Institute. We're a small organization, about 2 years old, and we train writers to create really excellent B2B marketing content.
The first time somebody asked me to write a survey, I felt like I was being punked because they came up and said, here's $100 or $200 a question. Can you write us a 10-question survey that we'll send out, and then you'll write a report on it? And I was in absolute heaven because it felt like I just got to write test questions and then think about really interesting things and then write about really interesting things. I kept waiting for the catch, but it's since become my favorite project to do. And every year in the Content Marketing Institute B2B marketing benchmarks report, it's in like the top 5 of best lead generation tools people use. So I think that's why it's really important. More of us get into it, more of us learn how to do it, and just write really good content that's a conversation starter for brands that they could do with their audience. So today we have 4 people who are actually practicing original research. These are the people who, if you Google original research and try to hire somebody, they're going to pop up and you're going to hire them. And I love that even though they have really good ideas, wrong song. Even though they have really good ideas, they're out there doing the work. So they really understand how to put together a survey, how to ask the right questions, and then how to report on that stuff. So I'm going to pass it over to Michele, and I'm so excited to see everybody.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Totally.
I'm going to share my screen. It is great to be here today and kick off with this great group of people. Excuse me, I've been talking a lot today. What we're going to tackle first today is we're going to be talking about how to set up your research strategy. And like Sarah said, she got this call a long time ago or a while ago, and she's, hey, can you write these survey questions and put this report together? And I think that so many marketers and so many writers get so excited to jump in and start thinking about those questions. And it's often the place that they want to start because it is really fun, just like Sarah said. But I think it is really important to step back and put the strategy together first so that they're going on the right track. So what we're going to do over the next 20 or so minutes is look at this strategy. And my goal is to keep this really simple. I don't want to over-engineer it. I just want to make sure that you guys have some really good questions to answer yourself or to ask your clients, just to make sure that your research is going to be as successful as possible. So we're going to be going through each of these 6 essential elements. And as a quick note, at the end of this, I link to a cheat sheet with all of this, all the questions I ask. So feel free to take notes or feel free just to listen because I'm going to document all of this for you. And the other thing that we're going to do today, just because I think it's helpful to see an example as we go, is as I go through this strategy, I'm going to be sharing with you an example. And this comes from a study called The State of Writing by Typeset Content. And I chose this example to share with you guys for several reasons. One, I think that the topic is really interesting. You guys are all writers. It's about writing. 2, I like this survey because it's one of those projects I've worked on, so I know about it ins and outs, and I can answer any questions about it. But the third reason is that this was a survey that was done by a content marketing agency, Typeset. They were a new agency in 2019 out of Australia and the UK. And they were launching their business, and they got in touch with a good friend of mine and said, you know what, we want to launch our business on the back of an original research project. That's how we want to get our name out there. So this project was scrappy. They didn't have a big budget. They didn't have a big list. They didn't have any of those things, but they just said, what can we do to get our name out there? And I think it works well. And it's a project that's not aspirational. It's something that you guys can actually do right here, right now. And as not surprisingly, Sarah Mitchell, their owner, has said, you know, what a wonderful project this has been for them. She says the initial return on investment in original research is already proving to be far more fruitful than any other marketing we've done to date. So this stuff works. So let's get started. So the first thing that your strategy needs to include is goals. And this is true of any marketing strategy that you've done ever. So this is nothing new or surprising. But I recommend that you guys ask 2 questions to your clients or answer these yourselves, like I said. First of all, what is the ideal outcome for this project? What does success look like to you? And then also ask, why is this research important to you right now? So those two they're getting at similar things, but sometimes by asking the second question, you're going to get some different insights of why, just instead of these brand words like brand awareness and so forth, you'll figure out what it needs to do to their marketing right here, right now. So what's going to happen is you're going to hear all of these different things. Chances are you're going to hear, we want to do this for brand awareness and thought leadership and leads and email subscribers. We want this to fuel our entire editorial. We want mentions. We want SEO. So research does work on all of these levels, which is very true. But what you're going to need to do is to have your client or yourself hone in and say, what are those 1 or 2 most important goals that you really want to focus on? And that's going to have to be the back of your mind as you go through this whole process so that you make sure that you meet those goals. In the case of Typeset, they really wanted email subscribers. They had a new email newsletter that they were launching, and they really wanted SEO. They want it to be known in the rankings. And just as an FYI, they were very successful in both of these regards. When they first published their research in 2020, their last one just came out, their email subscribers popped. Unfortunately, it was right as the pandemic was also happening. So it was a challenging time, but they saw a big increase in their email subscribers. And they also saw a really large increase in their domain authority just in 1 month. So it's since gone up. So it was very successful for their goals. Okay, 2. The next thing I highly recommend that you do is that you get specific and you figure out who the audience for your findings are. Ask yourself, who is the one person you want to impact most with your research? One person. I know people will typically say they want the research to do a lot of different things for a lot of different people, but really choose that one audience because you want your report, just like I'm sure Sarah talks about with writing, write to one person, don't write to some group, so it's just as effective as possible. But of course, also ask what other audiences will be interested in your research findings, so you are keeping those secondary audiences in mind too. Because oftentimes your research not only speaks to your core audience, but there might be other groups of prospects or customers you want to reach. Research is great at reaching influencers and journalists. And a lot of clients I work with also want to use their research to reach their internal teams like sales, customer success, the product team, and so forth. So just do a really quick thing, document who those audiences are, who's your primary audience, who's your secondary audience, just so that's always front and center for everybody. In the case of Typeset, their primary audience was those who are running content marketing programs, and they specified a really specific revenue band. But they also wanted to reach all business communicators and writer influencers, the press, and so forth. Okay, next. This is where I think things get really fun. Is you need to make sure that you have a unique angle for your research. So one question you really need to answer for yourself is what other research exists in your space? So in the case of Typeset, like I said, they're a content marketing agency. They went out, if you type in state of content marketing or content marketing stats, you're going to be inundated with all of these different reports about content marketing. Sarah said CMI has been doing their budgets, benchmarks, and trends reports since 2010. So that's not a place where you guys want to compete. Instead, you want to answer, what questions does your audience have that has not already been answered by other research? That's where you need to go. So when you're in a crowded field, don't go broad, don't look at the industry landscape. Instead, take one specific area and get really focused and really niche and be great in that area. Next, and this is another fun part, is I want you guys to be thinking about, as you're thinking about survey questions, I know that Gilda's going to be talking about that coming up next. So I'm not going to go into how to write survey questions, but I want you to start thinking about the types of stories you can get from your survey. And there's typically 2 types of survey questions you can ask. The first type of survey question takes an inventory. And those are things that basically say, we want to know as much about our industry as possible. And there are those stats, like so many people are using video or all of those types of things that are very industry leading that people link to. And there's nothing inherently wrong with these types of inventory stats. It can be wonderful if your goal is SEO. But the problem with them is that you publish them and then you're like, what next? What do I do with them now? So your goal is to make sure that you're asking survey questions that can tell a story and they're answering, so what? Who cares? So I'm going to take you guys through a bunch of different questions to ask Sarah and I were talking about this right before we got started. This is the place where you have to mind meld, like the answers might not be imminently clear of what stories you want to ask, but these are some types of questions that you can answer, or that your client can answer, to get you thinking about the types of questions you can ask. And then the next webinar presentation, you'll figure out how to ask those questions. And again, I have all these documented for you. But I love this question. What type of thinking is occurring in your industry that you'd like to challenge? What do you stand against? And if people can tell you this, chances are it's going to result in an interesting survey question or two. So in the case of the state of writing, one of the things that they really believe, and I'm sure you have seen this too, is that too many businesses are trying to create more content, but they aren't willing to invest more in that content, which is really frustrating for all of the writers out there. So they asked two different questions. One, does your organization plan to increase or decrease the amount of content that they produce in the next 12 months? And then, does your organization plan to increase or decrease your budget for content in the next 12 months? And what we found was a really, not surprising, but an interesting disconnect that can lead to some really interesting stories. Okay, another question that's a really good question to ask is, how do you want your audience to improve? So one of the things that we discovered last year with the state of writing is that the most difficult part of the writing process, I'd be curious if you guys agree or disagree, is understanding what your audience wants to read. So this year we asked, how do you determine what content your audience wants to read? And what we found is that a lot of marketers and writers, they were looking at things like analytics and social media and so forth, but they aren't actually spending time with that direct contact with customers, like talking to them and running surveys, or even participating in these online communities where your customers hang out. So that's useful, and it's great to say, if you want to know your customers better, if you want to have better written content, these are the places where you should be looking into. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys some more questions. I don't have an example for every question because it's a small amount of time to talk, but hopefully that kind of gives you an example of how to take an answer and translate it into a survey question. But here's some other questions I would definitely consider. What kind of stats do you want to be known for? Why do you want people linking to your website? Or what's something in your industry that you have evolved your thoughts on recently? I think this is a really interesting question, and I think it can make your survey very of the moment and now. So you can find some really interesting possible storylines out of this. Or what are the biggest missed opportunities in your industry, with your clients, with your customers, and so forth? Or how do you want to impact someone's thinking? What do you want them to do after reading your research? Hopefully you don't just have them read it and then go on to the next thing. You want to actually make some impact in their life. Another question I always like asking is, how is your perspective different from others in the industry? This is a great way to find someone's niche so you can really stand out and you're not just in the crowd saying the same things. Or the last one, what is the Oxford comma debate in your industry? As writers, we can all relate to this. You're either for the Oxford comma, you're against the Oxford comma. I happen to be for it. But what are those questions that you can ask that people want to talk about, they want to answer? Because when you get that data back, you can share it on LinkedIn and have a conversation about that data. So it works really well. And then as a bonus idea, and this is strategy 2.0 a bit, once you figure out what your angle is and once you figure out all those stories that you want to tell, I highly recommend that you group your questions into 4 or so categories. It's almost like the table of contents of your research. This is going to help you, create your questions much better. It's going to help with your data analysis. It's going to help with your storytelling. So build that framework in from the get-go in your strategy. Don't wait till you're trying to write the report and you're trying to figure out how it all flows together. So in the case of the state of writing, they have 4 different categories they were working with. Their content overview, they ask questions like, are you spending more? Are you writing more? What kind of content do you create? They asked about the writing process. What type of, are you using a managing editor? Are you using a proofreader? What's difficult? And they have a whole section around SEO to understand how difficult people think SEO is and what they're actually doing. And they also had a question about a section on the impact of writing. So what goals do you want your writing to have and what actually happened? And quite frankly, what does effectiveness even look like? That's such a loaded word too. Okay, Next, you want to make sure that you have a plan for your survey responses. And this is where sometimes you almost need to do this ahead of time. How do you plan to get participants? I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I'm more than happy to answer questions. You basically have 4 options. One is you can use a consumer-based study, and there's many consumer panels out there. SurveyMonkey is a great example of that. But most clients want to use B2B, they want to survey other B2B professionals like marketers or HR people. You have 3 options. You can, 1, use your own list if it's large enough. There will be a bias, but I've always found that has not been an issue as long as you're transparent. 2, you can partner with another organization. This is a great way to get the word out. Or 3, you can use B2B panels. I have a love-hate relationship with B2B panels. I'll be completely honest, happy to go into more depth about that, but that's certainly a third way. It's just going to be your most expensive option. So if budget's an issue, that one might be off the table. And then the last thing that I think that your strategy should include is a basic launch plan. And I know Matt and Kim are going to be talking about this in a lot more depth, but I think it's helpful to have a really quick look at what this might look like so you can plan for it throughout the process. So the questions I would ask at the beginning would be, do you want your report to be gated or open access? Pros and cons to both. Because what you want at the end of the day is to have your research live on one page, be it a blog post, be it a landing page, any page that has good detail about your research, not a PDF, not the actual form. So you want to pick one page. With State of Writing, they picked a nice blog post. And then the next question you need to answer is, what do you want someone to do after they read your research? So make sure that you have a next step for someone to follow. Otherwise, they'll read it and they'll move on and you won't get as much benefit from it. So that one page is going to point to that next thing. It could be anything like an ebook or a toolkit or anything like that. State of Writing, their call to action was email subscribers because that was their goal. And then the third thing I always like people to answer, what are your key marketing channels? Because what you're going to need to do at the end, and again, Kim's going to be talking about this in a lot more depth, is you need to have all these amplification assets point to your one page that's going to point to your next step. So if you can start thinking about what those formats are from the beginning, that's really helpful. And what I always tell people to think about what's your research goal? How do you spend your time? What are those channels? And what lives in the middle? And this chart that I have here that's quite frankly incomplete, you can see, okay, let's say your goal is backlinks. Well, you want to have articles on other sites, infographics, and so forth. And in the case of Sarah, she wanted backlinks. So she did things like she loves to be a guest on things. So she participated in podcasts, she did presentations, she did interviews, and so forth. So don't over-engineer it, but just try to think about where can you most easily be to get bang for your buck. So with that, again, I have a cheat sheet. I have to give me 10 minutes to finish it up, I'll be honest, but these are the essential things you guys need that we've talked about: your goal, your audience, your angle, your story-worthy insights, your survey responses, and your launch plan. And I know Sarah said she's going to send this out at the end, but if you guys have questions, anyone on this call can attest. I love talking about research. Always happy to help. So reach out anytime and let me know what I can do. Thanks, guys.
Cool. So if you have any questions, put those in the chat because I have 6. So I'm going to try to squish them in because this is fantastic. I think in a past conversation, we talked about a cool example of going deeper when you're asking survey questions. So we had this example of a webinar company surveying their audience, and it's you wouldn't send out a survey of do you use webinars to people who are on your webinar company list. That's a waste of a question. So could you talk a little bit about going deeper and finding different angles, maybe instead of just asking about behaviors or obvious questions, but what would you ask a webinar company audience to make a really interesting survey?
Yeah, I guess a couple of things with this. Surveys don't measure behavior, and I'm not being corrective at all, but I think it's really important that people realize if you want to understand how many minutes someone's staying on a webinar or something like that's user data, that's not survey data. People can only report what they believe to be true of themselves. But as we all know, our own behavior is very different from what we actually do. But surveys are great at sussing out attitudes or future-looking trends and so forth. And the other thing I would say too with the webinar example is not only is your example a waste of a question, but it's going to be bad data because it's so biased. So I wouldn't ask it at all because then people would want to use it. And they're like, look at all these people using webinars. That said, I think that you can always ask people, you can ask them where they're challenged with webinars, and you could do like editorial to help them with each of those challenges. You could ask questions about, I have lots of ideas, I'm just not popping up in my head. You could ask them what their future plans are with webinars, or what type of topics work well, or things of that nature, to really provide some interesting stories. And I actually just sent out an email newsletter today that goes through some different story types you can ask within survey questions. So if anybody wants that, reach out and I can forward my email over to them today that will walk them through some more examples.
Cool. And then I wonder, you had these great examples from Sarah. How do you, or when's the best time to ask clients to share those results with you? Or how do you get them talking about the results of their projects if this is something you really want to focus on?
Yeah, and I think I'll be honest, I need to get better at this for myself. I think it's good to ask them right when their project's done, because they have all of this excitement with how the process went. So if you want to get that type of feedback, that's a great time to ask. And then follow up in a few months when they can actually have some tangible results. That's the best of both worlds. You can report on how it is to work with you, plus how it impacted them.
Gotcha. Cool. And so any questions from anybody? I think we're good. I do have one more because this is just too good an opportunity. I think what's also really interesting is that the length of surveys can vary so dramatically, because I often see you doing maybe 20 to 30 question surveys that are really substantial. And then the ones I see most often for me literally have a max of 7 questions. So I wonder, how do you think about breaking down a topic when it's a really long survey versus a really short survey? Or is there anything to think about there?
Yeah, I think it depends on the audience that you're going after. So when I work with clients, they're typically are doing these bigger studies because they want them to be part of like their editorial fuel, if you will. So we need to ask more questions. And sometimes to get stories, you have to ask multiple questions to compare results and look at different things. From my experience, when you're reaching out to a list who cares about the topic or your community and so forth, people will typically take surveys. I've had surveys I thought were going to be too long and they get through them because they want the results back. So I personally wouldn't be that scared of doing a longer survey, but don't ask questions just to ask questions. Does that answer your question, Sarah? Or does that get at something different?
Yeah, that's interesting. I like it. Yeah. And I think understanding that there's a wide variety of survey sizes, that's even part of the strategy conversation, is how deep do we want to go into this topic and where do we want to spend our time when we break it down?
Yes. And some clients might want to do many more shorter surveys, and you can always release the results of one and launch the next survey on top of that and so forth. So it could be a good way to have an ongoing strategy if you want to do shorter surveys.
Nice. Cool. Thank you so much, Michelle. And
thank you.
You have just amazing resources for writers who really feel drawn to this topic. So if you head to mantisresearch.com, there's going to be a freebie download about original research. Doesn't get much more meta, but just wonderful materials and so friendly and great stuff to follow on LinkedIn too. So everybody check out that link.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
Like I said, anyone, feel free to reach out anytime. Always happy to jump on a call, answer questions, anything.
Thank you for sticking with us, this presentation on original research. And like I said, I hope this either gives you insight into how to make your process better or confidence to pursue this as an original research project, because this is a really great way you can become a partner to your client, not just the writer monkey who takes the assignment and does it and then runs away, but to be someone that they go to as a resource to actually fulfill lead generation, SEO, attention, ideas, thought leadership. It is a jargon word, but it also is really meaningful for companies that are trying to invest in it. And writing, it's just how thought leadership comes out there. A webinar starts with an outline. A podcast starts with interview notes. Like, words are how this is happening. So if you can get in there and be the smartest person in the room, like Matt said, I'm going to be thinking about that quote all day. If you can be that smart person that they want on their marketing team, that's how you build a really successful business that has a lot of recurring business to it. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next month.